Professor Michael Lewyn of Toro Law Center, Director of Toro's Land Use Institute. My co-host is Jen Casey, who is Chair of the Institute's Advisory Board. Our guest today is Benjamin Schneider. He is a freelance journalist who has written a book that we are going to discuss called The Unfinished Metropolis, and he is also a freelance journalist. So welcome.
Hi, Michael and Jen. Thanks for having me.
Hi. So tell us about this book. It looks pretty exciting.
Thanks. Yeah, it's here behind me above my left shoulder. It's coming out on October 21st. And basically, in a nutshell, what it offers is a discussion of the biggest problems that American urban planning over the last century has caused and the big ideas, the innovative solutions that could fix a lot of those problems.
And do tell us what can fix those problems.
Well, we can go category by category, but the book proceeds according to first a section on housing, then a section on transportation, and finally a section on workplaces. There are very specific solutions in each of those chapters that I'd love to get into more, maybe one by one or however you want to approach it.
Yeah, that sounds great. I guess housing would be a great one to start. I mean, we're here on Long Island where housing is a massive challenge, and I'm sure it is where you are as well.
Yeah.
And that's something I also chair the Planning Commission for Suffolk County, and we're very excited about new housing projects, but nothing seems to be affordable for anybody anymore. So that's a challenge. So if you could share with us how what solutions you have for housing challenges.
Yeah, definitely. Well, housing is a generational issue for Americans. It's one of the biggest challenges facing everybody, and it's become a huge force in politics. It's finally getting a lot more recognition as an important issue to be focused on. So that's been exciting as I've gone about my research and learned more about the issue and the solutions there. But it's one of those wicked problems that does not get a silver bullet solution. But I think there's a number of important pieces. One is zoning reform, making sure that it's legal and possible to build housing in the places where it's needed in high demand areas, particularly around transit stations out on Long Island by the LIRR. There remains a great deal of very low density zoning. This is something that the state of New York has tried to tackle in the past and hasn't quite been able to change that at the state level. But that would be a really important first step. Then there's the matter of financing and making sure that you've got funding sources for building housing that are not just fully tied to the whims of financial markets. Right now, in a very high interest rate environment, that's a really difficult time for developers to build. And so that's where mechanisms like public development authorities can come in and help projects break ground. There's some really interesting programs in Maryland. Chicago is just starting a very similar program. And the premise is basically people need housing now, but the financial markets are not providing the environment for projects to break ground. So this public entity can come in and provide a certain amount of the financing to get things started. So those are two really important pieces that I touch on in my book.
With respect to Chicago and Maryland, is the housing that they're building, is it apartments, single family residences? What kind of housing are these public entities putting out there?
The Maryland program is the farthest along. And what they do is they basically serve as a mezzanine lender for projects that have already been proposed by private developers. And they basically say, if we're going to provide you this loan, then you are required to offer 30% of the units at below market rates. And so these are large apartment complexes in transit-oriented areas. They're aligned with the other kind of smart growth goals that the county, and this is in Montgomery County, Maryland, right outside of DC. It's aligned with the broader vision that leaders there have of how to develop better urbanism.
And how long has I'm sorry.
You said mezzanine lender, so explain that term.
Mezzanine lender, yeah, basically it's a loan that is at the beginning of a project that will get paid off before the project is fully paid off before the sort of 20 or 30-year time horizon of other kinds of debt instruments. So it's like a shorter term loan.
And how far along has the programming been in Maryland? How long have they been doing this for?
They've been doing this, I think, for like 3 or 4 years now, and it's sort of the most advanced of this class of sometimes called social housing, sometimes called mixed income public development programs that are emerging around the country. There are other ones, as I said, there's a Chicago one that just got launched. Boston is looking into this. Hawaii is doing some work around this. I spoke to the main leader of the program in Hawaii, who's got very big ambitions about the sort of mixed income public development program there, helping to curb sprawl and produce kind of the type of urbanism that advocates have dreamed of, building high rises next to transit stations on the new transit line they're building out there in Honolulu, ground floor shops, mixed use developments. He thinks all of that can be done by this public entity kind of working in concert with private developers.
Do you think that there's in New York there was a push to have more ADU units in with housing, which they have in other parts of the country? Do you think that's also something that will help solve some of the housing challenges as well?
Definitely, especially in more suburban areas like in Suffolk County out on Long Island, where you may not have amazing transit access immediately at hand. You don't necessarily need, or there isn't demand for apartment buildings in some of these places, but ADUs are an amazing solution for intergenerational living or students, or just people that want to live in a community that doesn't have a wide range of housing stock. ADUs offer that without really changing the look or feel of a neighborhood, and it's one of those things that has come a long way in other states. In California, ADUs are fully legal and they can be built just about anywhere. The sky has not fallen, so it's one of those things that you'd think it would be a pretty easy lift for New York State to just instate that fully across the whole state. But so far that has been elusive.
Yeah, I think the big pushback, especially on Long Island, it's not on a county-wide basis. It's more on the towns and villages with enacting their own regulations. I mean, even I live in Huntington, and you were able to have accessory apartments for you can still. They're highly regulated, but they've made them so difficult to have them. You can no longer have them in basements. They have to be a certain amount percentage smaller than the main. There's so many hoops you have to go through, and you have, it's challenging, I think, on many levels because they want to limit them. And I think that is a big challenge here
Yeah.
for having more housing.
This was a big issue in California where ADUs were first legalized statewide in 2017, but it was the same situation where there were a lot of very specific local regulations that many of which were kind of designed in bad faith to just stanch ADU construction
Yep.
altogether. And so the state kind of progressively over the next 5 or so years chipped away at those loopholes and created more state level regulations that said effectively cities are required to allow ADUs of certain kinds virtually everywhere. And now ADUs make up, I believe it's a third of new units in Los Angeles County.
Wow,
So it's a
that's
big
amazing.
chunk of the new housing that California is building. I think that's also indicative of the broader housing shortage in the state of California. That's not fully like a positive figure, but
Right,
it does
because a third
show,
of nothing is still nothing.
right. It does
But
show
I
that
think that
it can be
sometimes,
significant.
yeah. But I think that the ADU housing sometimes can be more affordable than some because we've had a lot of new construction around in Huntington Station on the train station, but studios go for $3,000 a month, and that's not affordable.
Right, right. Well, another good example of how zoning reform can produce affordability is in Portland, Oregon, where they did what they call a missing middle housing ordinance, which basically legalized townhomes and cottage clusters up to 4 to 6 units on pretty much all plots in the city of Portland that were zoned for single family homes.
Wow.
And that happened in 2021-ish. And the city just released a report a couple months ago about sort of the first 2 or 3 years of that program. And they found that of the units that were produced, it was about 700 units. These homes are on average $200,000 to $300,000 cheaper than other single family homes in these same
Wow.
neighborhoods. So it's a pretty clear sign that these kinds of reforms can pretty immediately unlock affordability improvements for middle class households. That it's not going to solve the challenge of housing the homeless or helping the lowest income households, but it's a really important step to broad based affordability.
And what are your thoughts on when they take other like old shopping malls and office buildings that are being converted into housing? How do you feel that falls into this solution?
Yeah, it's a really exciting trend that is, I think, just getting started. I think we're really in the early days of the office and mall to housing conversion story. And my chapter in the book about this subject, it's called 15-Minute Malls, really imagines what these kinds of environments can be like. I talk about how in previous eras of urban history, these sort of peripheral centers of commercial activity were always conceived as second downtowns. They would have a lot of the attributes of a traditional city center with a mix of uses, transit access back in the streetcar days, not so much parking, a lot of activity on the streets. And then that model shifted in the mid 20th century with the advent of the car-oriented urban development model, where you have shopping malls and office parks that are strictly single use, that are only accessible by car, and that don't really have anything going on besides that primary function. And so the idea of converting malls and office parks into housing and mixed use villages or town centers could really go back to this old ideal that has been very successful. I think if you look at some of these neighborhoods that I'm thinking of, places like way back, Midtown Manhattan was one such place. This sort of competing second downtown. Midtown Atlanta is another place. There's a New Center Detroit is another place. Hollywood in LA. These are all these outlying commercial centers from the early 20th century or earlier that were able to become centers in their own right and have a really dynamic mix of people and activity. And I think malls can become that too in our century.
Well, I think in New York City, like the downtown in the financial district, there have been a bunch of buildings that have been converted. I worked at a firm years ago that building was converted into residential. And if you go downtown now, they call it FIDI, the financial district, and it's much more lively, lots of families, completely different than it was 20 years ago. It's really interesting what's happened. But out on Long Island, we have an office park. 110 is a major thoroughfare through western Suffolk County, and there's a lot of office space that's not being used, and there's proposals right now to make housing out of those areas. And there's been some pushback, of course, but what'll end up happening is they'll go to studios and one bedrooms as opposed to 2 or 3 bedrooms, which is what we need is more different types of stock of housing. But it's right on a major arterial, which
Mm-hmm.
is great, and it's easy to get to the train stations and stuff. So I think that is really important to look at some of this vacant office space because it's already it's easier I think to convert some of this, and it's open space and there's parking already too, which
Right.
is it's a big part of it.
And these downtown office to housing conversions, like the transformation of Lower Manhattan,
Yep.
shows the template. It's
Oh
possible
yeah.
to repurpose office buildings and make them into housing and have really positive results in terms of reactivating neighborhoods and bringing a lot of new life. So I think that precedent should help people see the possibility here in these more suburban places where there's also a lot of opportunity to do office or retail to housing
And
conversions.
even some of the colleges, like NYU, has such an enormous real estate footprint in New
Hmm.
York City. And one of the dorms is an old hotel that was converted into dorm space. They've expanded their campus into Brooklyn Heights, and they've converted a building into dorm space. And now they're even into other areas of Brooklyn, expanding their footprint. So they're looking at adaptive reuse of buildings too for housing for their students because their students can't get apartments. It's so difficult on so many levels. So what the other parts of your book? You said the first part's housing, and then the
Yeah.
other sections.
Well, transportation is the next section.
Yep.
And I talk about one of the key themes there is basically how public transit became such a marginal form of transportation in most American cities at the expense of or rather, because of all of the enormous auto infrastructure that was developed, over the intervening years. And I view that as a historical inflection point, where we basically disinvested in transit and invested in highways And today we live with the ramifications of those decisions. So I think it's really important to have that historical context on kind of how we got here, before then thinking through how do you unmake that, and the most radical ideas are tearing down freeways, and making new neighborhoods out of them. In some cases, maybe even putting transit lines where those freeways have been. But beyond that, there's many steps in between to just make buses more reliable, more appealing as a means of transportation, developing reforms for rail systems, like the folks at the NYU Marin Institute have been talking about, electrifying railroads, building high-level platforms, and effectively with some relatively small infrastructure improvements, you can get 20 or 30% time travel increases that, again, just make transit a more competitive mode of transportation. So those are some of the things I'm thinking through in those chapters.
And where have there been places where the highways have been torn down that has been successful?
Well, the West Side Highway in New York is one of the canonical examples. Ironically, that highway in the late 70s, there was a dump truck carrying cement to repair the highway that was rolling along and was too heavy and caused a partial collapse of the viaduct. And so that was the impetus for the city to then take a look at that and say, maybe we shouldn't just rebuild it, we should just tear it down. And I mean, anyone who's visited there, it's very clear that highway removal has sparked an enormous amount of development. It has created a much more livable urban experience. And I think I've also seen some data that transit ridership in that area increased, probably in large part because the population has increased a lot. So you can create these virtuous cycles of better neighborhoods without the sort of toxic infrastructure that makes it such an unpleasant place to live, that then support transit systems, support local economies, boost housing stock, et cetera.
I'm sure you're aware with the High Line, which was an abandoned rail tracks, is such an amazing way to walk from Lower Manhattan to more Midtown area, and you have just amazing views, and it's been so well designed, and it's very popular. It's so crowded sometimes, but it's a nice way to travel via foot rather than dealing with traffic and other things. So I think that's a great example of something that can be done in other cities with abandoned rail lines.
Definitely.
And so forth.
Yeah, the High Line is an amazing template for these kinds of rails to trails projects, which actually exist in a lot of cities. They're not quite as spectacular as the High Line. The Belt Line in Atlanta comes somewhat close. It's quite a beautiful space that's had a very transformative effect. And I talk about these kinds of projects positively in the book. I think it's hard to argue that they're not, making their neighborhoods better and giving people recreation opportunities and all these positive benefits. But there is sort of one piece of one potential issue with this kind of project that many people may not think about, which is that they're emblematic of all of the rail mileage that the U.S. has shed over the last few decades, as the few freight rail giants consolidate their operations following this practice called precision scheduled railroading. That's part of the reason why we have all these trails available for recreation, is because railroads have pulled back and there's less track, and that limits the possibility of expanding passenger service in many cases. And it's just emblematic of this larger challenge of how do you expand passenger rail in an environment where the freight rail companies own and control the track.
Well, and I think also, like on Long Island, one of our challenges is that the railroads are diesel out to certain areas, and they really need to be electrified. But the amount of investment is incredible.
Yeah.
And I think it goes to the argument that these are really public utilities in a way. Like they have to be subsidized because they will give so much back if they are improved. The traffic out here is unbelievable. Both the North and South Forks of Long Island, the Hamptons, as well as the North Fork as well. So many people go out there, not just during the summer, but all year round. And it's very challenging to get out there on the train system because it's not reliable, even between towns, like out in the Hamptons. I have friends that live out there, and And they were like, if we could just have a reliable train that go from town to town, because the traffic is just so, ridiculous
Hmm.
to get from town to town. If they have younger kids that want to get a job in another town, they don't want to sit in the car for an hour just to get their kids someplace that's, 5 miles away to go work at a summer camp or something over the
Right.
summer. And those are really big challenges, that we're facing out here. And it's hard because it's so expensive to, increase these rail lines. And I'm sure we see that in other parts of the country.
Yeah, and you're right. It is extremely expensive to electrify a railroad in the US. But one thing that I found researching this book is that part of that is a product of just our lack of experience in doing it. There's a lot of research that shows as countries start electrifying railroads, the per mile costs get cheaper and cheaper. And there's actually some really promising technological innovations on the horizons that could make railroad electrification cheaper, specifically better batteries, as the sort of uh, green energy transition and electric vehicles writ large are kind of getting more technologically advanced. That battery tech could be applied to trains and create a situation where you only have the overhead wire, the catenary, for maybe a third or a quarter of the distance that the train is traveling, because in the other sections it can just run on its super powerful battery and then
That'd be
recharge at the
great.
next spot. So that's the kind of uh, technology solution that could make these kinds of projects a lot better, but a lot more feasible. But the challenge is, you really need research and development capacity at agencies. New York State maybe has some ability to do that. Caltrans maybe has some ability to do that in California, but generally it would be up to the federal government to pursue that level of research and development, to make these kinds of technological leaps.
And then the you said there's another section from your book of the other uh, solutions. And what section is that?
Yeah, that's about workplaces. So it's about, I mentioned my chapter called 15-minute malls.
Yep.
So that's in that section. And then there's other chapters about the story of downtowns and their development, as well as the story of industrial architecture and urban design in the US. So the downtowns chapter is kind of tracking the history of uh, really ambitious panaceas that have been put forward over the course of America's urban history to revive downtowns, going back to the urban renewal era and the sort of vogue of trade centers and convention centers. More recently, it's been stadiums and casinos that are sort of seen as these silver bullets to fix what ails downtowns. And there's a mixed record there. I mean, there have been some positive projects that have come about from these kinds of visionary development ideas. But by and large, they haven't really produced sort of sustainable urban economies with people who live there, people who shop there, sort of business, a set of businesses that service people's everyday needs rather than just tourists or convention goers. So I think that is sort of the new frontier of urban of downtown redevelopment and reimagining, is making these 24/7 neighborhoods that are for ordinary people, for residents, not just sort of in the worst case, sort of business class vanity projects for the city.
And I think it's having the right mix of housing, entertainment, and restaurants, food, all those type of things you need to make it a
Hmm.
vibrant community. Because it seems, with these convention centers and/or casinos. I know in New York yesterday they came out with recommendations as to where casinos might be built in the future, and you know I don't see that helping any kind of downtown revitalization where they're putting these casinos.
Yeah, yeah. Just in the last few days, the news has come out that the commission that's leading that process of deciding where these casinos are going to go have rejected all of the Manhattan locations.
Which is a
So
good thing.
yeah, I think there's definitely a strong case to be made that Manhattan doesn't need that kind
Yeah.
of investment.
And,
There's
and
there's
actually, it really coalesced. The theater district really came together
mm,
to fight that, and I think it's great because I think it would have really ruined that culture. Also, I saw Coney Island; they didn't want to ruin that for that cultural experience for people. My concern is some of the locations they have chosen will create some traffic nightmares, but
Mm,
because
Well,
one of them is
certainly.
right over the White Stone Bridge,
right.
where there's a golf course now, and as it is now, it's so challenging leaving Long Island that putting something that large right on the other side of the bridge, and then you're going to have the other one over by Shea Stadium, so that they're
Hmm.
so close to one another, and that's a vital link for people to get
Yeah.
off of this island.
Yeah, it does seem a little bit excessive to have two
Oh
casinos
yeah,
within a couple
that
miles of
close.
each other.
Yeah,
Yeah, and the
yeah,
Shea Stadium location at least has great transit access.
yes.
And I think there's some, there's a lot of other kinds of mixed use development happening in that
Yeah, the one in
area.
the Bronx, there doesn't seem to be as much transportation over in that area.
I
There, I
know I
think
haven't looked
there's
into that one. Yeah, I'm not
that
sure.
one is. It looks to me it's right on the other. I thought it was right on the other side of the White Stone Bridge where there's a golf course currently, and there's buses, but I don't think there's any trains really in that area. But and
Hmm.
cars.
Yep.
Michael, do you have any questions?
Yes, I know in your book you talk about single stair and double stair
Yeah.
apartments, and which is one of these issues that I don't think was very much in the press until the past year or two. So why don't you talk about that?
Yeah, this is a really exciting frontier for building codes in America. People that are plugged into housing probably have heard a lot about zoning. I mentioned it obviously earlier. But building codes are a really important force shaping what kind of housing gets built and how and the quality of it once it's done. And there's this movement that, Michael, as you said, is gaining traction in kind of the press and in policy circles around single stair architecture. And so basically, the idea is under current building code rules throughout virtually all of the US, to build an apartment building above 3 or 4 stories, that building needs to have 2 points of egress, two stairwells that serve every unit. And what that uh, essentially forces in terms of the building design is a corridor with units on either side, much like a traditional hotel design. And so that, if you look at apartment buildings built in the last 20, 30, 40 years, that is typically how they look. Um, if you look at older buildings, they have this single stair layout typically, like some of the prettiest pre-war apartment buildings in Manhattan. They're oriented around a single like vertical column that includes the elevator and the stairwell, and then there's a small landing with like 4 to 6 units on each floor. And a larger building might have many of these columns. So in that single stair scenario, each unit only has the 1 point of egress, which historically has been a concern for fire officials, understandably, that if that one corridor is blocked, then people are trapped in the building. In the past, that was fixed by fire escapes, which is a ubiquitous sight in New York. All the old single stair apartment buildings, whether it's the pre-war luxury buildings or the old tenements that are now like railroad style apartments. That's why they've got those fire escapes. But what this movement has found, and what folks in many, if not most, other countries have found, is that with modern building materials and firefighting and codes like sprinkler requirements, you can create very safe buildings, just as safe, if not in some cases more so, with that one stairwell, particularly below a certain size threshold. And when you do that, you unlock these new design possibilities. With the double stair corridor design, most units just have one exterior face. So that means the one bedroom apartment is sort of the default um, unit size, which, Jen, as you said, is a concern for a lot of officials that want more family housing in their area. But with that single stair design, you really create the possibility for more dynamic unit architecture and interior design, because each unit can kind of be set on like a corner of the building, or if it's more like a star shape, you can get exposures from 3 or even 4 sides. If you've been in some of the nicest, really old Manhattan apartment houses are like this. They've got these really interesting shapes that are the reason that they're designed that way is to create all these exposures for windows and bedrooms. So it's an exciting policy movement that at its core is designed to make apartments more livable and more attractive to a wider slice of the populace.
So I would like to thank my co-host and guest for a great discussion, and we will see you next time on Lewyn on Land Use.
Thanks so much. Take care.
Thank you.